In AP Research, each of the assessment tasks focuses on a set of proficiencies or groups of learning objectives that students should be able to demonstrate. The ones circled here in red are those that the academic paper addresses. As you can see, the academic paper focuses on all of these proficiencies except for reflect, which, as I stated before, will be addressed by the presentation and oral defense. Of course, the presentation and oral defense addresses more than the reflect proficiency, but we'll save that conversation for the first module. Before we move on any further to discuss the rubric in detail, take a few minutes to download and print out and then familiarize yourself with the academic paper rubric. And as you review the rubric, pay close attention to the gray boxes underneath each of the score points and think about how you would describe the difference between a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, a 4 and a 5. The academic paper rubric is in the style of what we call a holistic rubric. What that means is a single score will be given to the paper as a whole instead of adding up subscores that are given for individual criteria like is done with an analytical rubric. For the academic paper, the student can either receive a score of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And even though there are 6 bullets used to describe the finer points of each of these score points or levels of achievement, you're not making a score decision about how many more bullets are reached under one score point versus another. You are making a score decision based on the balance of the strengths and weaknesses of the paper in relationship to the holistic description of each score point. Before we get into the finer details of the rubric and the description of each of these score points, let's read a couple of student samples. If you recall, on the previous slide I stated that you will be making a holistic decision about the balance between the strengths and weaknesses a paper demonstrates with respect to the bullets under each score point. To make it easier for you to find these strengths and weaknesses within a paper, here are some general descriptions of each of the 6 bullets under each score point. The first bullet pertains to the focus and scope of the topic of inquiry, research question, or project goal presented in the paper. The second bullet assesses how well the paper situates their inquiry in the knowledge of the field by putting in a conversation with other studies of multiple perspectives and identifying a reasonable gap in the current field of understanding on the topic. The third bullet addresses the extent to which the paper provides a replicable capital R research method aligned to the purpose of the inquiry. The fourth bullet focuses on whether or not the paper presents a well-supported new understanding using evidence generated by the student's research method. The fifth bullet pertains to the quality of the writing in terms of style, design choice, word precision, and frequency of errors that can distract or confuse the reader. And finally, the sixth bullet refers to the way the paper handles the citation and attribution of sources. Before continuing, please download the following sample papers and read them. The one on autoimmune disease, which should be sample 1, and the time for dinner, which should be sample 2. And as you read the papers, ask yourself 4 questions. First, what was the topic of inquiry or project goal or even research question? What was the replicable research method used, and that's capital R research? What was the new understanding developed as a result of the method employed, and what evidence-backed claims were used to prove this new understanding was even being made? Here you can review what is the difference between these two papers in terms of research topic, capital R research method, claims and evidence, and the overall new understanding. We're going to use these differences to determine the scores for these papers when applying the rubric. Take a minute to take a look at my description of each of these sections and see if it is congruent with what you determined when you read the papers. Looking back at the academic paper rubric, I want you to look at the holistic description between a 2 and a 3. This is a very clear dividing line that I like to call pass and not pass. In fact, when you use this holistic rubric, the first decision you should make is whether or not a paper crosses that line from the left to the right. Let's look at what it takes to cross that line from the left to the right. In the third of the 6 bullets, we can see that this is about whether or not the research method described is replicable. It is either described with sufficient detail for you to repeat what was done, or it is not. The fourth of the 6 bullets, we see another major difference. Either the paper demonstrates a summary or a report on what is already known, regardless of the method, or it conveys a new understanding. To a lesser extent, but not to ignore these, other differences between a 2 and a 3 as finer points can be found in the quality of writing, in competently communicating the inquiry process without confusing the reader, and in the consistency and effective use of a disciplinary style to cite and attribute sources in text and in the bibliography component. Further, in the Lit Review, we're looking to see if students can use mainly scholarly sources with a variety of perspectives to situate their topic of inquiry instead of either offering a single perspective from scholarly works or multiple perspectives through mostly non-scholarly works. These aren't the main deciding factors in the holistic decision between a 2 and a 3, but they can be used as tiebreakers in those papers that seem like a high 2 or a low 3. So in effect, there's a major dividing line you can use as the first decision you have to make when applying the rubric. Either the paper has a reasonably replicable capital R research method that leads to a new understanding, or it does not. If it has these two things, it can cross the line and you can further evaluate the paper as a 3, 4, or 5. If it does not have these two things, it does not cross this line, and then you can further evaluate the paper as a 1 or a 2. So let's evaluate. Where would you place the autoimmune A paper in terms of this dividing line, and where would you place the time for dinner T paper? Well, seeing as the autoimmune paper did not contain a replicable research method, but instead called a second lit review a systematic review of the literature, this paper does not meet the first criteria to cross the line. And seeing as the autoimmune paper yielded a conclusion that was not a new understanding, but in fact a summary of what was already known, that the less you know about a disease, the less you will have in place to cure or treat it, this paper does not meet the second criteria to cross the bridge, and now this paper is either a 1 or a 2. Now, for the time for dinner paper, seeing as it describes a replicable research method of a codified content analysis combined with a qualitative freeform analysis, it passes one of the criteria to cross the bridge. And since the paper presents a new understanding about the meal kit and TV dinner convenience food advertisement themes over the past 50 years, it meets the second criteria and crosses this fence. And now all we have left to do is to decide whether it's a 3, 4, or 5. But before we do that, I want you to read another paper on your own and see if you can decide whether or not it crosses this fence. Please download the third training sample of Perceptions of Public Transit, and remember to ask yourself the following questions as you read the paper. What was the topic of inquiry? What replicable capital R research method was used? What was the new understanding developed as a result of the method employed, and what evidence-backed claims were used to prove that this new understanding was actually being made? Now that you've finished reading the Perception of Public Transportation paper, I'm going to give you a minute to think about how the answers to the questions I asked you to think about match with what I have here on the board. As a reminder, the first holistic decision you have to make when applying the rubric is, does the paper meet the criteria of a reasonably replicable method and a new understanding as a result of the evidence from the method? So, does this paper on perceptions of public transportation meet these two criteria and cross the bridge? Well, although it's not the best survey in the world, this paper does use an actual research method of employing a survey for online participants, and the method is reasonably replicable. We're halfway there. Does this paper reach a new conclusion or understanding? Yes. Although it's not the best supported new understanding, in reference to the research question posited, the paper does conclude that there is a negative perception of MARTA, or public transit, in the Atlanta area. This paper crosses the bridge. Okay, now that we have two papers that cross the bridge, let's determine if they are both 3s, 4s, or 5s. The holistic difference between a 3 and a 4 is mainly that your 3 paper exhibits a new understanding. It's not well supported, or it doesn't address a reasonable gap in the understanding of the field because either the focus wasn't very focused as it was carried through the entire inquiry journey, or that the new understanding was not well supported because the method's alignment to achieving the purpose was questionable, or at least not well defended. To that point, the difference between a 3 and a 4 focuses primarily on 4 elements of the rubric: a focused inquiry, a defensible research method, and a well-supported new understanding that explicitly connects back to a gap in the field of knowledge among differing perspectives of scholarly works. To a lesser extent, but not to ignore it, the difference between a 3 and a 4, as a finer point, is in the consistency and effective use of an appropriate disciplinary style to cite and attribute sources in text and in the bibliography component. This is not the main deciding factor in the holistic decision between a 3 and a 4, but it can be used as a tiebreaker in those papers that seem like a high 3 or a low 4. So let's summarize this difference in a more simplified way. Let's pick apart the time for dinner paper T and the perceptions of public transit paper P. If you've already made the first holistic decision that certain papers cross the bar from a 2 to a 3, the next holistic decision you need to make is if the papers cross the bar from the 3 to the 4. This bar is made evident by looking at the focus of the inquiry, the defense of the method employed, and the extent to which the argument is supported and addresses a gap. If we look at the perceptions of public transportation paper, it has a nice lit review. It explicitly connects previous studies to the topic of inquiry at hand. However, the study of the Atlanta Beltline, which is the focus of this paper, is not connected to the student's topic of inquiry very well, which leaves the reader without an explicit description of the gap that this study is addressing in the context of the current field of knowledge. And you can see that on pages 6 through 9. Further, even though this paper has a reasonably detailed method, this method isn't well defended by recent studies in the field or current literature on the appropriateness of using the survey, types of questions asked, and or the questionable sampling technique, which can be seen on pages 9 through 11. Finally, the student's argument was meant to address the perceptions of Atlanta area respondents on public transportation in Atlanta, otherwise known as the MARTA. Yet, the majority of respondents to the survey came from about 3% of the population that comprises the Atlanta area. The claims made here are not well supported, and the student even indicates such on pages 11 through 12, with no addressing of the limitations of this hiccup in the method on the following pages. For these reasons, this paper cannot cross the bridge from the 3 to the 4. Now, for the Time for Dinner paper, we can clearly see that it has a reasonable review of the literature of the field with explicit connections to those studies and its focus of inquiry on pages 3 through 7. The method is used and defended by other studies in the field on pages 7 through 9. The topic of inquiry is focused to an exploration of how identified advertisements for meal kits and TV dinners address work-to-family conflicts, and is carried through the method and is found to have a new understanding, spelled on pages 10 through 21, addressing a gap that is clearly identified on page 2 and even connected back to on page 21. In this way, the Time for Dinner paper crosses the bridge from a 3 to a 4. But does this paper cross over into the 5 score? Well, let's look at the rubric. The holistic difference between a 4 and a 5 is whether or not the paper exhibits a critical analysis of the new understanding and how well it addresses a gap, as well as whether it's written in an engaging and clear way, or elegant, if you will. To that point, the difference between a 4 and a 5 focuses primarily on 2 rows of the rubric. First, the extent to which the limitations of the conclusion and how well it addresses a gap are explicitly explained alongside the implications, which means you're left with no questions in why something was done a certain way or whether or not the student was being hyperbolic, because they'll tell you. And it also focuses on the extent to which the paper demonstrates quality of writing through a series of intentional choices that were made in terms of design elements and word precision. At the 5 score point, these choices enhance the communication of the student's argument and the clarity to which that argument is made to the reader. In fact, you're not left with a single question as to why a table is present or not present, labeled or not labeled, or why certain terms were used. So let's summarize this difference in a more simplified way. If you've already made the first and second holistic decision that a certain paper crosses the bar from a 2 to a 3 and from a 3 to a 4, the final holistic decision you need to make is if the paper crosses the bar from a 4 to a 5. This bar is made evident by looking at the explicit nature of explanation of the limitations and implications of the conclusions. Otherwise, the student is being super critical of their own new understanding and super critical about how well it fills the gap identified. And then also, this bar pertains to how well the paper demonstrates intentional choices in design elements and word precision to engage the reader and enhance the clarity to which the inquiry process is communicated. If we look at the Time for Dinner paper, we can see that even though it describes limitations of the conclusion being made on pages 20 through 21, there's no mention of why different TV dinners other than Swanson advertisements were used. Further, in terms of the clear and engaging writing with intentional design choices, many of the data tables in the paper are not labeled as to what commercial or advertisement was being evaluated, which makes it evident that the writer was not intentional in the design of the tables to make the communication of the results clear. For these reasons, the paper cannot cross the bridge from a 4 to a 5. Now, as you can see, we still have the autoimmune disease paper to nail down. Is it a 2 or a 1? The holistic difference between a 1 and a 2 focuses mainly on whether or not the topic of inquiry is focused at all beyond a quintessential library lowercase r research topic, and whether or not a capital R research method is described or identified, regardless if that identification or description is actually such a method or not. To that point, the difference between a 1 and a 2 focuses primarily on two rows of the rubric: an actual attempt at narrowing a research question or project goal versus a broad topic of inquiry, and an identification of an oversimplified or incorrectly used capital research method versus a description of just a search and report series of steps. So let's summarize this difference in a more simplified way. As a reminder, the first holistic decision you have to make when applying the rubric is, does this paper meet the criteria of a reasonably replicable method and a new understanding as a result of the evidence from that method? We already determined that the autoimmune paper did not cross this bridge. So now all that's left is to determine if this paper remains a 2 or is better scored holistically as a 1. The major criteria that separates a 2 from a 1 is whether or not there's an attempt at identifying or describing a capital R research method, even though it may be oversimplified or incorrectly named or used, and whether or not there's an attempt at narrowing the scope of the inquiry beyond your classic library report about a broad topic. This paper has an attempt at a narrow topic of problems with autoimmune diseases, and to what extent does the lack of knowledge hinder advances in treatment for autoimmune diseases? Of course, this isn't very narrow, but it is an attempt. Further, even though it is incorrectly used, the student identifies on page 6 a capital R research method of systematic review. However, as we read through the paper, we find that the systematic review that was employed was simply a review of the literature of the field to yield an understanding or a conclusion that was not new. The conclusion of the less you know about a disease, the less effective cures or treatments will be available for patients with those diseases. For these two reasons, the autoimmune paper does not cross down into the 1 category, but firmly remains a 2. So now that we've discussed the bulk of this rubric, I need you to read 2 more papers so that we can complete our rangefinder, which is a phrase I will use to describe this image that we're building on here, to simply describe the decisions you need to make to help your students evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of their papers throughout the year. Before continuing, please download the following sample papers: Sample 4 on misogyny in the hip-hop culture, and Sample 5 on acculturation and iron intake of Mexican-American immigrants. And remember to ask yourself these questions as you read both papers. Now, before you settle on a score for these 2 papers, labeled M for misogyny and hip-hop and I for iron intake, let's follow the decision pathway. First, does the paper cross the bridge from a 2 or a 3? If it does, determine if the paper crosses from a 3 to a 4, and then if it still does that, does it remain a 4 or become a 5? Finally, if it did not cross the bridge from a 2 to a 3, does it remain a 2 or bump down to a 1? Alright, ready? Let's go. Take a minute to review my notes here and see if they are congruent with how you summarized the components of the 2 papers that you just read. Let's make our first decision. Does the iron intake of Mexican immigrants paper, I, present a replicable method accompanied by a new understanding? Yes, which means paper I is at least a 3 and could be a 4 or a 5. Does the misogyny of hip-hop paper, M, present a replicable method accompanied by a new understanding? No, which means paper M is at most a 2, but could be a 1. Alright, let's focus on the iron intake paper. Let's pick apart the acculturation and iron intake of Mexican immigrants paper, capital I. Since we already made the first holistic decision that this paper crosses the bar from a 2 to a 3, the next holistic decision we have to make is if the paper crosses the bar from the 3 to the 4. Again, this bar is made evident by looking at the focus of the inquiry, the defense of the method employed, and the extent to which the argument is supported and addresses a gap. In the iron intake paper, we can clearly see that it has a reasonable review of the literature of the field, with explicit connections to those studies and its focus of inquiry, pertaining to the extent to which acculturation plays a role in the amount of iron in home-cooked meals of Mexican immigrants in Maricopa County, Arizona. We can see that on pages 1 through 3. The method used is defended by other studies in the field, see pages 3 through 5, and it yields evidence that is used to develop a well-supported new understanding, spelled out on pages 6 through 7, addressing a gap that was clearly identified on page 3 of home-cooked versus convenient food and connected back to the gap on pages 6 through 7. In this way, the iron intake paper crosses the bridge from a 3 to a 4. But does this paper cross the bar over into the 5 score? Well, remember that the bar between the 4 and the 5 is made evident by looking at the explicit nature of explanation of the limitations and implications of the conclusions, otherwise the student being critical of their own new understanding, and how well it fills the gap identified, and then how well the paper demonstrates intentional choices in design elements and word precision to engage the reader and enhance the clarity to which the inquiry process is communicated. In the Iron Intake of Mexican Immigrants paper, we can clearly see it presents an elegantly written inquiry process with intentional design choices that are discipline appropriate, as well as precision in word choice. Further, the paper explicitly explains the limitations and implications of the new understanding to the field on page 7. And if you're in doubt about this score, compare the writing style and design elements of this paper, along with the critical analysis, against what you saw in the Time for Dinner paper. There is no contest that this paper definitely crosses the bridge from the 4 to the 5. Alright, let's take a look at the misogyny in hip-hop paper. As a reminder, the first holistic decision we had to make when applying the rubric is whether or not the paper presented a reasonably replicable method and a new understanding as a result of the evidence from that method. We already determined that the misogyny in hip-hop paper did not cross that bridge. So now all that's left is to determine if this paper remains a 2 or is better scored holistically as a 1. The major criteria that separates a 2 from a 1 is whether or not there is an attempt at identifying or describing a capital R research method, even though it may be oversimplified or incorrectly named or used, and whether or not there is an attempt at narrowing the scope of the inquiry beyond the classic library report about a broad topic. This paper identifies a broad topic of inquiry on page 2. For example, the student says, for my AP research project, I'll be studying why views on women have changed negatively over time in the hip-hop culture. This topic is too broad because hip-hop culture is multifaceted. The paper contains no explicit mention of a research method, see page 1, and where the student says, in this project I'll be studying music articles and documentaries to get a true understanding on why it's become increasingly popular in this genre. For these two reasons, the misogyny in hip-hop paper crosses down and earns a score of 1. So, here we have it, our rangefinder, which gives us clear and simple decision points to at least determine if a paper is a solid 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. For the more nuanced papers, or for papers where you're on the fence, you should refer to the finer points of the rubric. And finally, although the rubric and associated rangefinder does not address zeros, a student can earn a score of 0 on the academic paper in the following ways: by either plagiarizing the paper, which is proven by evidence, not submitting a paper, or submitting a document that is completely off task, like a drawn picture, short story, or letter to a grandparent, etc. Alright, with that out of the way, and now that you have the rangefinder and the rubric, try your hand at scoring some more student samples. Feedback will be provided for you in the form of commentary. Good luck!